Whew, okay, so the autopsy, last days of Chris Benoit, was something. It was deeply disturbing. So the Benoit thing is something that we can talk about till we're blue in the face. But a lot of the facts are there. You know, the autopsy was there. People could go through it. I don't want to litigate the thing about whether I think that it's silly at this point to discuss whether Chris Benoit quote unquote really did it or not. I think it's pretty obvious from looking at things that Chris Benoit was the murderer of his wife and his son, and it's unfortunate. But you could also argue that maybe he wasn't in his right frame of mind. But there's just no way. So what did I find particularly interesting about this? Um, let's go straight to the what they call the turning point in the life of Chris Benoit, which is the death of Eddie Guerrero. Now, one of the interesting word came up where they called Eddie Guerrero Chris Benoit's soulmate, and despite I think they may have said wrestling soulmate, I think they may have said that, but they certainly used the word soulmate. And when you look when they discussed this, the death of Eddie Guerrero, they discussed it. They said it's one of the guys said it's the most traumatic event in Chris Benoit's life, and they routinely showed him crying, which of course he cried at the Eddie Guerrero tribute show in 2005. Was it 2005, 2006, something like that? And it it was. I can see what we need to realize is as people, introverts like Chris Benoit. Like Chris Benoit was from everybody who knew him. You could hear that he was essentially a quiet guy who was very, stuck to himself, and maybe he didn't have a wide variety of friends. And when you don't have a lot of friends, each friend is like it really means something. Like when people have a lot of friends, they're just friends on the surface. Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit seem to be friends below the surface. Now, what are they friends to the point of being quote unquote soulmates? I don't know, you know, but I can see that it devastated him. It devastated him to the point where his wife had to buy him a journal so that he could deal with his grief by writing it out, and that means that he was crushed. He probably needed substantial psychological help at this point. Of course, he had already been using steroids. He had already been abusing steroids. He had already, been abusing painkillers for his broken neck and all that type of stuff. So you're talking about years and years of drugs and, steroids at this point. Because they said Chris Benoit wasn't really a drinker, but he began to drink near the ends of his life. But there's a lot of substantial psychological issues in this episode. Not just the physical of them telling us what happened to Nancy and Daniel, but also what happened to Chris himself, that he sort of deteriorated over the years. That he went from being a relatively quiet, subdued guy to being abusive, but they used the word abuse. But they didn't say that he hit Nancy. They said that maybe he had coercive control over Nancy, that he was paranoid, that that Nancy was concerned about his mood swings, which of course is a byproduct of the steroids and the drugs that he was taking, which would make sense. The steroids, the drug, the painkillers, all that sort of things, the death of Eddie, all these sort of things are just kind of like mixing up and causing him to change his personality. And I think that's the thing that I walked away with, is that when you talk about Chris Benoit, you're essentially talking about two different people. You're talking about Chris Benoit before Eddie died, and then Chris Benoit afterwards. Because, maybe, and when you see, and I know that Vice is doing a documentary on this, I'm probably going to do a notes of that as well. But when Vice drops their documentary, I think that Chavo and Chris Jericho and all those guys who knew Chris Benoit for years, they knew Chris Benoit before Eddie Guerrero died. They didn't know the Chris Benoit afterwards, because the Chris Benoit afterwards seemed to have been a more morbid he had suicidal ideations, going back to the journal that he had written in his journal that he would see Eddie soon, and which I guess you could say is not that big of a deal because everybody, maybe he was, heightenedly aware of his own mortality, but then again, he was also a religious man, and you kind of believe that, when you die, you're going to go to heaven and you're going to see your friends again. So I don't want to read too much into him writing "We will see you soon," but he was having a lot of problems. He was having a lot of problems at home. They talked about Nancy's text messages where she was apparently texting various people that she was concerned about his behavior, his mood swings, and his paranoia and his anxiety and all these sorts of things, and which I hadn't heard before. I didn't know they had dug up Nancy's text messages, but they didn't really play too many of them, and I'm pretty sure if there was like some huge bombshells in there, they would have played those, but they would have showed them or talked about them or whatever. But there was also a lot of talk that Nancy and Chris were actually going to divorce in 2001. That Chris had pretty much was kind of a spurg in 2001, when he broke his neck. But she filed for divorce and she threatened to leave him, and that he was able to talk her into staying around. Another thing that I didn't know was that Nancy also had a lot of drugs in her system. Now here is where the situation gets really weird for me, because Nancy, Chris, and Daniel all had drugs in their system. Daniel had Xanax in his system, or what they call alprazolam in his system, and they say it's consistent with him being drugged because it was high. Now that becomes the problem because we know that Chris Benoit killed his family. So now we're asking, did he premeditate to kill his family? So Nancy was bound by the hands and feet. She had elevated levels of alcohol and alprazolam in her body. So you're talking she was bound and then strangled. Apparently Daniel was drugged and then strangled. And then of course Chris, after strangling Daniel, and this is where we really get into bizarro land, he looks up a Bible quote to about resurrecting children, and there's some talk there that maybe he realized, maybe he came down from whatever he was on and he realized what he'd done, and maybe he felt bad for it, he felt guilty, but at the same time he was also preparing his flight to go to the show. Now, for those of you who don't know, there was a pay-per-view that Sunday. The Sunday he was supposed to be at the pay-per-view, he didn't show up. That's the pay-per-view where Johnny Nitro won the ECW title and became John Morrison. Chris Benoit was supposed to be in that spot. And apparently they said Benoit was actually booking flights to go to the show. And, he then, after he did book the flights, he decided just to commit suicide. So he was walking around with his family dead, and he was going to go to work. And that's absolutely scary. That's frightening. Okay. Like that's some absolutely Texas Chainsaw Massacre type shit, and I have no words. There is absolutely no words for that. Like I never once believed that he didn't do it. Okay. Especially after, WWE decided they were going to cut ties with him and they weren't ever going to mention his name again. I figured it must be pretty bad, but I never took the time to go through everything outside of, whether steroids was the reason why he killed his family or something like that. Even though, which steroids likely didn't help, but he had so many other problems that, and then they were also in a very combative relationship also, for several years apparently. So maybe they just, they argued a lot, and maybe that was just how their household was. But that's some scary shit to think that he sat in the house and considered going to work, like considered going to Vengeance 2006, winning a fucking title with his family dead in the house. That's fucking scary. And you know what? It would have been, it's even scarier if he'd have done it, because I can guarantee you nobody would have known. He could have come home and be like, oh shit, my family's dead. And most people would have thought, oh shit, somebody killed him while he was gone. Like, that's some absolutely frightening shit right there. That's some movie monster shit. Okay. So, outside of that, which was sort of new to me, of course, they did the brain test where they found he had severe CTE, caused from obviously doing the flying headbutt for 300 days a year for 15 fucking years, 15, 20 years, which is absolutely stupid. And that CTE causes dementia, delusional behavior, violence, mood changes, and depression. So basically, anytime you damage your brain, you're running towards violence, mood swings, and depression, being, bipolar disorder, essentially. And Chris had, a history of steroid abuse, which also leads to increases aggression, and those sorts of things. And he abused hydrocodone, which is an opioid, which causes depression, anxiety, and mood changes. He had a titanium plate in his neck, obviously from when he broke his neck. And he also had suicidal. It said that hydrocodone, or the opioid painkiller that he was taking, leads a lot of people who take it commit suicide, and that it does lead to suicide ideations. And years and years of abusing drugs, steroids, head injuries, that can change a person. That really changes a guy. And it's difficult for many fans to separate Chris Benoit, the performer, from Chris Benoit, the man. And of course, the situation should always be, which one, for fathers out there, there is no question that Chris Benoit is probably the most heinous, piece of shit that to ever exist, along with other people who murder their children. And that's pretty much the end. That's the period on the statement right there. But for other people, and maybe even those who have a soft spot for folks who might have been brain damaged, for people who, we always have, and even in our penal code, in the United States, we have that you can't put mentally ill or mentally damaged people to death. Right? You can put them in prison for the rest of their lives, but you can't execute the mentally ill. And if somebody has deteriorated to the point where they're mentally ill, we almost that's when you sort of trip over somebody's sympathy, that they really cannot be held responsible for their own actions. It's called mens rea. I study criminal justice, so I know these law and this stuff. So it's called mens rea. Basically, did you have a guilty mind? Did you know what you were doing is wrong? And they say that certain people have brain damage, or they just have critically low IQs, that they can't really be held responsible for their own actions. And I think that's where we at with the Chris Benoit situation. And the doctor says, okay, he said that there is no doubt that Daniel was drugged. So this leads to the argument that maybe Nancy was also drugged, which then leads to the concept of premeditation, which means Chris Benoit premeditatedly murdered his family. So you can't say at that point that he did not have a guilty mind and that he is the most horrible piece of shit to ever exist. Downside of that is we don't know if Chris Benoit gave Daniel the drugs, because Nancy also had prescriptions for alprazolam, and at least I'm pretty sure it's called alprazolam. Just call it Xanax. Also had a Xanax prescription. And look, man, some people do give it to their kids. And this is unfortunate, but I've seen people do it. I've seen people go into their prescriptions and give their kids various things to help them sleep or to help them relax or whatever. But I think that the amount of drugs that Daniel had in his system is consistent with somebody trying to put him down. And Nancy also had an elevated alcohol and alprazolam in her system. So apparently he didn't want either one of them to fight back. So we don't know if they were drugged, but the evidence pretty much says that they were drugged, and that he drugged and then murdered them, and that's fucking horrific. That is horrific. And then the idea that he was actually booking flights and sending text messages, and we don't know if these things were coherent or not. Like there's some stuff that was left out of these documentaries. So we don't know what was the nature of these things that he was sending out, but they did say that he was booking flights and stuff like that, trying to go to work. And like I said, man, that's fucking horrific. And so I think that we're looking at a tale of two Chris Benoits. Chris Benoit, not just Chris Benoit the performer, Chris Benoit the man, but Chris Benoit before Eddie Guerrero died, which was quiet, subdued, maybe started, fucking around with the steroids and too much and almost lost his wife in 2001. And then his friend dies and he just becomes more morbid and he becomes paranoid and he's filled with, depression and rage because there's nothing he can do. And, and they also talked a lot about him maybe, knowing that he was older and losing his spot and losing his career because, you hit that 40 mark and you start to decline. WWE moved him to ECW to sort of use him as a gatekeeper. And maybe he wasn't cool with that. And that was mentioned too. And that's something worth discussing as well. But I think that's what we're looking at here. I think we're looking at a pre-Eddie Guerrero death Chris Benoit and a post-Eddie Guerrero death Chris Benoit. And it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, sometimes you do things that are so heinous that defines who you are. And I think that's where we're at with Chris Benoit. That he did something so terrible, something so ugly and gross, that it pretty much, there is nothing else to appreciate. Now, I'm not going to say I'm never going to watch another Chris Benoit match. I'm not that person. I can sit back and enjoy his matches, I guess, but I'll never forget, and you'll never actually forgive somebody who murdered a child. And there's just no way. And the idea of him being in the WWE Hall of Fame is offensive. Okay, people talking about it is offensive. The fact that he is in other Hall of Fames is equally offensive. So I have no idea why people are, I guess some people can separate the wrestler. Like I said, I can watch the matches. I don't believe in supporting him though. And I just don't know why people would do that. So I just don't know why, he would be in your Hall of Fame, especially if you're one of these, sort of SJW individuals out here who, want to pontificate morally about what people do in the wrestling business. And, Chris Benoit is in your Hall of Fame. I'm just not sure that that's smart, but the Chris Benoit story is going to be talked about infinitum forever. I'm also going to do a notes for, take notes for when the Dark Side of the Ring episode comes out. Because then that'll actually have, there was no notable wrestling people in this documentary. But that one's going to have at least Cornette, Jericho, and Chavo Guerrero, who are close friends with Chris Benoit. So they're probably going to be able to get a little bit more of a deep dive on this. This one was more about the drugs that might have been in his system, his state of mind, his psychology, all of which is very interesting. And it's beyond wrestling. It's not just the wrestling business. It is this man as a body. He damaged and fucked up his body for our entertainment. And that has repercussions. The years of abusing painkillers, the years of taking flying headbutts and getting hit in the head with flying metal chairs, that stuff has repercussions. And that's what I think this is about. This is what the science of the Chris Benoit story is all about, is looking at Chris Benoit as a corpse and saying the titanium plate in his neck came from a match at King of the Ring. All the concussions fucked his brain up to the point where some doctors say it was the equivalent of an 80-year-old man with dementia. To me, that's what the Chris Benoit story is, outside of the guy who murdered his family. It's not about wrestling to me. It's about a guy who destroyed his own body for our entertainment. And now we kind of have to shun him for it because he destroyed his own body for our entertainment. And then he went and did some fucked up shit. So that's a crazy paradox to be in, because you can look at it, you can, maybe it's kind of ugly to look in the mirror and say, did we ask for all of that? Did we want him to do all the stuff that he did? You know, could you have deleted the flying headbutt from every match? Yes, absolutely. You know, what about some of the steel chair stuff that he did? What about some of the other ugly bumps that he took? With him being a smaller guy, those bumps probably hurt a lot more. You know, those probably jarred him a lot more than the average guy. So those are the types of things that I'm gonna take away with when I walk away from this documentary. Not necessarily a burning hatred of Chris Benoit. I've never had a burning hatred of Chris Benoit. I just think that, you know, we're living in a situation where you have to hold him responsible for what he did, but also have to understand why it happened. You know, and if you understand why it happened, then you have a nuanced view. Not a sympathetic view, but a nuanced view where you can understand that this guy murdered his family, but that he really was wrecked. You know, from top to bottom, he was wrecked. And there's just no way of being able to fix that. There's no way, because wrestling, it's the wrestling business. You want people to walk away from the wrestling business perfectly fine. They should never be in it in the first place, because there's going to be injuries. There's going to be guys taking stuff that they shouldn't take. There's going to be guys drinking too much. And unfortunately, the wrestling business, you know, the longer Chris Benoit was in it, the worse he got, you know. And he was in it for 20 years, over 20 years. He started when he was 18, and he died when he was 40. So, talking about a guy who spent most of his life taking bumps, jumping off cages, and, you know, broken necks and broken ankles and knees and all that type of stuff. But the guy who basically cried because he broke Sabu's neck by accident, to think that that's the same guy who murdered his own son, I don't think so. And so I have a nuanced view. I don't hate Chris Benoit, but I will absolutely say that he did it. He unequivocally did it. It's just a matter of whether he did it, he premeditated or not. And on that, I don't have an opinion on that, because I don't know. But if I had to guess, I would say he did. I would think that he probably, because Nancy had no defensive wounds because she was bound by her arms and legs. So that means he expected her to fight back. So maybe he did drug her. You know, maybe he drugged her alcohol or something. He spiked one of her drinks and knocked her out. I mean, he choked her. So this is dour. This is dour as fuck. Okay. So let me know what y'all thinking on my theory of the two Chris Benoit theories, and the theory of, you know, what do you think about these guys that are going out there destroying their bodies for our entertainment? And then we have to hold them accountable for the fucked up shit they did, even though, you know, kind of like China, where China, you know, went through, you know, doing the steroids and all, you know, the painkillers and stuff, because she also broke her neck for our entertainment. And it drove her down the road of just being fucked up. And there's a lot more people out there like that. You know, thank God Kurt Angle, you know, pulled himself back from the abyss, because we could have been talking about him too. You know, but, you know, Eddie Guerrero and British Bulldog and Mr. Perfect and all these guys who absolutely destroyed themselves. Even the guys who are still walking around, like Sabu and Mick Foley and Terry Funk. These guys who are losing ears and losing teeth and for our entertainment. And who knows, later in their later part of their lives, some dark shit happens, and it's connected in some way to their life as an entertainer. That's very different. That makes the wrestling business unique. All right, so like, share, and subscribe to this channel. I would appreciate that, and I'll talk to you guys later.